Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra,
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting untold stories of people.
associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked.
and sometimes what didn't,
You will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts.
And inspire you to do even greater things.
In this episode, I continue my conversation with Mohan Ram. In the first episode, he talked about his origin story and how he got into IT, and also moving to systems engineering and networks and looking at those areas to find applications in the commercial world. In terms of roles, getting into creating software products, as well as switching to project and program management roles. And he stressed the need to understand the nuances of project management. In this episode, the conversation continues about the challenges that he faced in balancing the need for working with details as well as with abstractions. We continue touching upon other topics such as how coaching and observations of people helped him shape his own ideas as well as his own styles of working. And what his personal philosophy is in working under contractual constraints, whether it is of cost or of timelines, and how Agile approaches are suitable to work more effectively under dynamic scope conditions. We then talk about how he developed an interest in philosophy and constant learning, and what he would like to do with the ancient wisdom in applying them to day-to-day contexts. And finally, his thoughts and tips on career-related questions for both entry-level people as well as mid-career professionals. Listen on. Yeah, I don't know whether the next question is related to project management, but when I look at what you mentioned as something that you like, that is interacting with customers and understanding their problems and so on, when you hear an expectation, either as a requirement or as a challenge that they are facing, and then come up with an approach or a solution to address that, and then you have, let's say, a project plan to realize that. So there is a level of abstraction that you need to be comfortable with, as well as attention to detail. Since you also mentioned that your manager pointed out that you are a person with a lot of attention to detail, how comfortable was it working in ambiguity?
To be honest, that was one of my main problems actually, and I think you again hit the bullseye. That was one of the problems for me. Life was more black and white as opposed to gray. It was either 0 or 1, and that's how I was sort of mostly looking at things at that point in time. So when you are sort of in front of the customer, again, one of the things that again I learned from some of my seniors and managers is that requirements. So let's use this word requirements not from a software development lifecycle perspective, not from an SDLC perspective, but in its generic import, right? So when you look at requirements, and typically when they come from customers, you've got to look at it in a very progressive sense, in the sense that requirements elicitation happens progressively. You don't have a bang, you meet the customer and suddenly you have clarity, he has exactly spelled out what it is. And even if the customer pretends that he absolutely understands the requirement and he has put out the requirement to you and you sort of nod your head and say, I got it. Go back, check, because probably, if you don't check, you're missing something which the customer has not told you as a requirement, but which can actually bite you. We call this as implicit requirements, which can actually come and bite you later in the, in the game. And there have been many instances, and people often get defensive about, no, this is not something that you mentioned, or this is not required, and we had, those days back in the day, we used to have V3 waterfall approaches, V3, V4, and it was heavy focus on documentation and actually transferring the pressure or the risk back onto the customer to say, if this is what you told me, this is what I'm going to do, right? And if you didn't tell me, then you won't get it, kind of thing. Today's times are very different in an agile context. We'll come to that in a little bit. But back in the day, we used to often pay a price in terms of not understanding some of those implicit requirements. And the reason we were not doing a good job of it, or I was not doing a good job of it, was that I was not picking up implicit requirements from customers. It was more like black and white, zeros or ones. And that's where, the concept of progressive elicitation of the requirement or progressive elicitation of the problem statement became very important. It came through coaching. It came, I got over a period of time, I got better with some amount of coaching, but through a lot of observation by seeing people who actually did a very good job of it. This is one important aspect that I'll share with you. The second aspect is, see, the life of a consultant, especially when you're client facing, is very difficult because you've got to really switch roles. If you were my client and I'm meeting you for the first time, the thought process that is going on in your mind as a client is that this guy who's sitting in front of me, why should I trust him? I have no data points. I mean, I have his CV, I have his profile, whatever, etc. But that's a piece of paper. And now this guy has presented himself before me. And I can see that he has 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 nose. But beyond that, how can I really trust him? It's the single most important thought process going on in your mind as a client. And this is where, again, I give another analogy, the analogy of a doctor. Supposing you're going to a doctor, would you be comfortable with a doctor who has got 2 or 3 lines of qualifications, MD, DM, FRCS, blah, 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 versus a doctor who basically asks you, what is your problem, makes you talk and then examines you physically, understands both your physical pain as well as the mental pain, and most importantly, gives you the confidence that you will be okay, right? Who will you be comfortable with? In my opinion, you will be comfortable with the latter. So I think as a consultant, before you establish credibility, before you get into a relationship with your client, you've got to understand the doctor syndrome and ensure that you've got to first cross the initial hurdle of winning the confidence of your client. Once you have that, then the other aspects of how do you manage requirements, how do you manage the relationship, how do you manage the commercials, blah, 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 they all fall in place. But if you jump the gun and straight get into, very tactical maneuvers, and your customer may be leading you there because he is in a hurry, and if you actually just blindly follow suit, then in my view, eventually you will dig a hole for yourself and then, sort of reflect on thinking that you could have done some of these things better. So again, long drawn answer, but two aspects to it. I think the first one is, in our industry, when you work with clients, it's never black and white. And the earlier you realize, the better it is. And the second aspect is winning the customer's confidence and credibility initially is more important than doing things right.
So if you prioritize this about winning the confidence, and you also talked about the implicit requirements and the need to understand them, is there a possibility of these becoming scope creeps, that if you are working under let's say a fixed price kind of a contract or something that is bound by deadlines and so on, could we be shooting ourselves in the foot?
Yeah, possible. So this is my personal philosophy. 2 things. When you look at contracts, time and material versus fixed price, and people talk about hybrid also, in my view, hybrid is just for sake of convenience, but in puritanical terms, it is time and material or fixed price. In my view, they have nothing to do with the project. They are basically commercial ways of engaging engaging with the client. And between the service provider and the client, you choose a particular way depending upon what works for both the parties. It has got very little, in my view, with the actual constructs of a project. I mean, there is some relevance, but not majorly in my view. Given a choice, most customers would like to do fixed price. irrespective of the complexity of the project. And that is why I would say it is more a commercial risk management kind of an arrangement as opposed to being intrinsically linked to the nature of the project. And that brings in certain, and therefore, if it is a fixed price engagement, then, it brings in certain amount of due diligence, responsibility, and accountability right from the word go. In fact, smaller the project, shorter the project duration, greater the risk if it is a fixed price engagement, right? So it brings in certain behavioral changes in you right from the word go. That's number one. Number two, Shivaguru, is I have never come across a project in my life, whether it was on the pure technical systems area or whether it was on the application side. I have never come across a project where there hasn't been a scope creep. There can be certain semantics going around it in terms of, no, you did not understand the requirements properly. And then sort of blame one of the two, right? I'm using the word blame in a very loose way, pardon me for it, but, sort of shift the responsibility because the requirements were not understood properly. But either ways, there is always a realization that there has been some scope creep. So in my view, the scope management aspect of it has always been more skewed towards, creeping on the extra side and not really, with regard to sort of being contained within a framework, which is where a lot of these life cycles that we used to practice about 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, in today's days and times, they seem to have some shortcomings, very glaring shortcomings, which is where you can debate. There is never a perfect life cycle, but then in today's times, whether this is agile or whether it is waterfall, this is where the debate comes in, and clearly the choices are, today the whole industry is tending towards agile. In my view, the single most reason why it is in favor of agile is that agile by design realizes that scope is always a moving target and provides you a certain systematic way to address those issues, as opposed to earlier life cycles, which in hindsight, I could say where they're always in the case of denial to say that if you manage requirements, your project will be okay. But that was in my view a lot of FUD. Actually, it did not happen that way.
Yeah, I think that puts the whole approach of agile and also handling this ambiguity or the evolving needs, particularly to meet the customers, also get clarity in terms of what they need. And that's a very nice way of putting it. The related question is, in doing this, I'm assuming that a person has to wear both a technical hat and a managerial hat. When it comes to a career choice of staying technical or becoming a manager, you had also mentioned that kind of a transition and some of the challenges associated with that kind of a transition. So is there a framework or some kind of thumb rules that an individual can use to first identify what is more natural to them and see whether either they can choose a particular track or shift from one to the other? And an extended question is, once you shift, is that a permanent shift or can you come back?
I think that's a brilliant question, actually, Shiv. So this is something that I've been thinking through. And in my mind, I'm trying to see whether I can actually put together some kind of I don't want to use the word cookbook or something like that. It's not a cookbook, but at least some kind of a starter kit for people to bridge the technology and business chasm. When I say this, bridge the technology and business chasm, I am not favoring one against the other. I'm not saying that eventually everyone becomes a manager. I'm not saying that. I'm also not saying that once you choose a technology career, you can't really make the switch, right? I'm not saying either of this, because in my view, there is so much of diffusion between technology and business that the fact that today there is a chasm between the two in itself is a problem for me. And I think the more you do to basically diffuse this chasm, the better it is for an individual, the better it is for the business, right? And I'm trying to basically put together, and I'm actually doing a bit of research to see, and I'm sure there is a lot of material out there for sure, but then something that I can pick which is relevant, simple to understand and execute, and whether we can actually put together some kind of a starter kit which will help bridge this chasm between business and technology. That's point number one. Point number two, I think you mentioned something which is very, very insightful. You said that based on an individual's, based on how an individual is wired, right? The individual could have certain affinities, it could have certain strengths, and so it could have certain weaknesses. Now, whether it is on the technology side or the business side, these are not in silos. If I have a certain technical strength, and if I'm able to actually link it to a business situation, right, that it actually becomes an opportunity. On the other hand, if I have a certain weakness on the business side, for example, if I don't understand P&L, or I have often seen techies saying, no, I don't want to manage people. I don't want to write performance evaluation, right? I don't want to get into any of those dirty discussions, right? Fair enough. Now, for lack of a better term, let me use the word weakness. It's not a weakness, actually. It's a certain quality of that individual, that the individual doesn't want to get into man management on a day-to-day basis, right? But then there could be certain aspects that this person could have which may actually relate to technology, to say, if I went to this particular client, I saw this, is there a solution, or is there some kind of a way to solve this particular problem, and can I actually engage with someone on the technical side, or at least kick off a certain discussion? That's a strength. So by my narration, you can actually see that these are not silos. Technology and business, they are not silos. In fact, there are certain aspects in each of this could actually, transgress. And it's, once we understand some of those things, I think if you provide certain avenues for people to self-evaluate themselves and come up with their strengths, which can actually bridge the two, then actually we are enabling that person for more success. And through that, we are actually enabling the organization for more success, right? Unfortunately, the way HR has gone about doing this, because I think it helps them in certain ways. I don't blame them for it. It helps them in many ways. They have basically tried to, sort of put this in certain silos because it had certain purpose. And somehow things have continued since then. And we have not really realized, as business leaders, we have not realized as to, some of the damages that it can actually cause. And sort of create the diffusion between the two. That is how I would say. Just to sort of summarize, I think the aspect of individual qualities that you touched upon, I think is very important in bridging the technology and business chasm. And the even more fundamental aspect in my mind is that there is no chasm. It needs to be diffused and actually brought together. And third aspect is, I am very curious to see whether I can help put certain things together, not as a cookbook, but at least as a starter kit for people to think. And if they want to start that journey, it actually gives them a certain method to get that journey started.
Yeah, that is very nice, Mohan. And it is probably also tending a little towards maybe some philosophical aspects that one needs to consider. And I thought that would be a good segue to understand some things that you mentioned in the beginning about your interest in ancient wisdom and philosophy and stuff like that. So how do you how did you get an interest in that? And second, many times when we talk about philosophers, we say they are eternal people who pursue something. So is there a goal that you have of what you want to learn?
I don't want to give it a religious color, but if you really look at it from a spiritual perspective, I think the quest for every human being is to realize oneself, to understand who you are, right? That I think is, now why do I say this? Not because I have realized it, in fact, I'm far away from it, but this is what I have read, this is what I have heard learned people say. And over a period of time, when I've had my moments of very, very profound, deep peace and satisfaction, where I felt, I've had moments where you don't feel fear, you don't feel an obligation to anybody, you don't feel, you're by yourself, right? In those very brief moments, when you achieve that kind of state of mind, it always feels that you need to experience that even more, and that probably leads you to realize as to who you are, right? So I think so. Just to sort of summarize, I think maybe if while it could be debatable, at least in my mind, if the objective or the ultimate purpose of human life was to basically realize yourself, I'd also realized through this journey that there were multiple ways to get there, as many masters have shown the way. But my thought process, and I'm taking some baby steps here. I have a very, very long way to go, and I don't know whether one birth is enough for that. But at least, in the context of what I have done and what I would like to do is some of the aspects of ancient wisdom, you call it as nuggets or principles or tenets or whatever they are. These are not beliefs. These are aspects which are more behavioral, which are more transactional, which can be brought to life in day-to-day conduct, right? How do you deal with stress? How do you deal with a person who is disinterested in work? How do you deal with conflicts which could actually tear your project into shreds because the customer has, while he has signed up, he has gone in a different direction. You are struggling with the baby in the bathtub, and your team members are totally disengaged, right? I mean, these aspects hit you in life on a day-to-day basis. And when you look at ancient wisdom, it gives you some very clear insights and brings a certain element of calmness in thought process and execution as to how you go about it. And the confidence that you derive out of this is that since this is ancient wisdom, and anecdotally, I don't know, through Puranas or through stories or whatever, if it has worked in certain situations, you basically gain some confidence as to if it has worked then, maybe it will work now, and why don't I try certain aspects of it. So in my professional life, at least in the last 10 years, I have consciously tried to, look at some of these things and bring it to bear in day-to-day life. And I've made some mistakes in the process. One of the mistakes you need to avoid is that you should never give it a religious color, because it is not meant to be so. These are basically principles, these are tenets, these are practices which can work irrespective of race, language, creed, caste, geographies, etc. These are timeless tenets and principles. And if you can actually bring some of those things in small measures to very specific situations and put it to action in the right way, then I think the results invariably, I'm not saying always, but invariably, they have the desired effect. So that is how my faith in ancient wisdom to solve contemporary problems comes from. And I think I'm just scratching the surface of it. There's still a long way to go. But in my limited experience so far, I'm actually more than convinced that there is a lot to dip into for us into ancient wisdom. And ancient wisdom can be across cultures, not just Indian culture, but across cultures to solve contemporary management and business problems.
Yeah, that sounds really deep. But I'm sure there is so much that we can dive into and then take from there. So even if we don't go back to the ancient times, at least from your own wisdom that you've gathered over time, what would be some nuggets that would be useful for two segments of our listeners? Usually we like to ask about what somebody who's considering a career in IT can do or should do. And similarly, somebody who is going through possibly an equivalent of a midlife crisis or a mid-career crisis on, do I continue with whatever I'm doing, whether it is managerial or technical? What would be some nuggets that you can share from your wisdom?
I think if I correlate to this my own trajectory, life trajectory, I would say if you're an early career individual who is trying to make inroads into the IT/software/services industry, I think it's very important to have a mentor at that stage. The Oli who came in my life, he actually was an Oli in my life. He brought in some light, to my life, and I think
Oli in Tamil is light, right? Yeah.
Correct. Right. So, I think early in the career is where I think we need very directive mentorship. Somewhat of a directive mentorship where a person could actually come back and say, I think you're better off trying this as opposed to that. Right? That's what I mean by directive mentorship. And I think many of the youngsters, just as we went through, may not even have the maturity to think about mentors. But I think whether as a family, as friends, or even as teachers, educational institutions and teachers, I think if we can bring this aspect of mentorship and inculcate that consciously, then I think it will help people who are sort of early career IT industry people through their initial phases of life. Not that they won't make mistakes, but when they make mistakes, how to pick themselves up and not make the same mistake, and also understand why those mistakes happen in the first place, kind of thing. I think that's very important. I think if I were to pick on one for early career, that is the one I would pick. Pick directive mentors in the initial phase of your life. There is no point in having a mentor to say, well, this is the large horizon, this is the canvas, and then pick your choice. For an earlier career person, that doesn't make much sense in my view. When you are sort of midlife, and you've had tasted some amount of success, you've also had your share of weaknesses and failures, and you're a little wiser. And then most people in midlife, they also have to balance a lot of family aspects as part of their professional life. Certainly the dimension changes, and that is by far the most complex phase of your life, the most challenging in my view. So at that point in time, I think that is where certain aspects of wellness, while mentorship and all of those things should happen, it's always good to have a mentorship and all of those things happen. But that is the phase of life, the midlife phase is where I think a lot of self-control and a lot of self-management needs to get into play. And I think this is where wellness comes into play. I think in terms of how wellness can help mid-life as crisis or opportunities, whichever you look at it, right? Wellness, I think, comes into play a lot more than anything else. I think that is I think the most important thing that makes a difference. Once you start understanding yourself, then you have a better appreciation of your environment, which is your immediate family, spouse, children, your parents, your immediate circle of relatives, friends, etc. Once that self-awareness happens, then you start understanding what are the dynamics going on. Then you sort of extend that to your workplace. You understand what's happening with your business, what's happening with your project, what's happening with your customers, what's happening with your teammates, right? And I think what enables you to have that better awareness and sort of sensitivity to things that are proximate to you is that aspect of wellness. So just to sort of summarize, someone early in life, IT career, directive mentorship is something that I would highly recommend. But as we sort of progress through life, we should start moving towards self-awareness. And I think whether it is individuals or teams or organizations, if they can invest on providing avenues for wellness, creating that wellness for their employees, I think it will go a long way in protecting their business interests.
Wonderfully put, Mohan. Yeah, with that, we are almost out of time. So I hope to continue to mine these nuggets of wisdom in our future interactions. Thanks for taking the time sharing your story with our listeners.
I must thank you, Shiv, first of all, for having me on this one. But secondly, I think for the very thoughtful questions that you brought in, which I think they are quite profound, and I can say that they are steeped in a lot of your own experience. And all I can say that you must be a very wise man to ask those questions.
I think I'm just curious. Just know that I don't know a lot. Thanks, Mohan.
Thank you. Thanks, Shiv.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.